Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. I'm Arjuna, and today I'm going to be talking about evidence for reincarnation. Particularly, I'm going to be focusing on the work of the late Dr. Ian Stevenson. Reincarnation is an almost ubiquitous belief among the world religions, with the only real exception being the Abrahamic traditions. But even in these traditions, we find some support for the belief and some believers. Within the Sufi sect of Islam, which claims to present the esoteric teachings of the Quran, we find belief in reincarnation. Mainline Judaism does not formally accept reincarnation, but within the mystical side of Judaism, the Kabbalah, reincarnation features prominently. Within Christianity, if you only look back as far as Thomas Aquinas, you'll find no talk of reincarnation. However, if you look back a little further, you'll find a few church fathers at least entertained the idea. In the Bible, we find a few passages which we could take as support for reincarnation. Once Jesus was asked if a man was born blind because of his own sins or because of the sins of his parents. One cannot evade the conclusion that the disciples here had reincarnation in mind. The man was born blind, so he couldn't have committed the sins in this life. Jesus had an opportunity here to reject the notion of reincarnation once and for all, but he didn't do this. He simply replied that the man was born blind so that the works of God could be displayed in him. Elsewhere in the Bible, we find Jesus saying that John the Baptist was Elijah come again. This seems clearly to be a reference to reincarnation. Now on to the evidence. I should start by pointing out that what we're dealing with here is evidence and not proof, meaning that the data is not conclusive with regard to the existence of reincarnation. It's evidence because it's difficult to explain by any other means, so it increases the likelihood of reincarnation being real. Dr. Ian Stevenson was a professor of psychiatry at Virginia State University, with an impeccable reputation for thorough, labored investigation. Even Stevenson's critics, in large part, had nice things to say about him. Here's Jim Tucker, who's carrying on the research work of Dr. Stevenson, reading one such quote.
The first of those books was reviewed in a little journal called JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is one of the top medical journals in the world. And the book review editor actually wrote the review and said, in regard to reincarnation, he has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases from India, cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds.
Here's a clip from another critic, the philosopher and skeptic John Martin Fisher, where he gives some kind words.
I accept their work as serious and thoughtful.
Dr. Stevenson's main focus was on children who spontaneously reported memories of a past life. He didn't like hypnotherapy cases because too often they turned out to be imaginary. There have been cases where a person was re-hypnotized and asked where the information came from, and it turned out that it was from a book they'd read earlier and forgotten about. There are some past life regression cases which do provide compelling evidence. I'll get to one of those later. But sifting the data from the noise is difficult because so much of it is imaginary. Hypnotherapy may be able to reveal memories of past lives, but it's also capable of generating false memories too. Dr. Stevenson liked to focus on the cases where children spontaneously remember past lives because it was far more fruitful in terms of finding strong cases. Strong cases here means many of the things the child said were able to be corroborated, making it compelling evidence for reincarnation. Here's a quote from a book written by Jim Tucker on the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, where he gives a summary of the evidence. In summary, cases from all over the world can include birthmarks that match wounds on the previous personality, statements that are accurate for the life of that person, behaviors that appeared to be linked to the person, strong emotions, unusual play, phobias, and unusual preferences, and situations in which the child was judged to recognize something or someone from that life. We can categorize all of that evidence into three groups: memories, behaviors and emotions, and birthmarks. If these cases consisted of nothing but memories being reported by children, then it would be easy to shrug it off as nothing but imagination and fantasy. However, when these memories include information accurate to a particular deceased individual and which the children could not have known by ordinary means, then we have good evidence for reincarnation, particularly when you combine that with birthmarks which match wounds on the body of the deceased individual and behaviors and emotions appropriate to that same person. Of course, fraud is always a possibility, but the large volume of cases and the nature of them cannot be explained away by fraud. In some cases, the possibility of fraud cannot be ruled out, such as in the famous case of James Leininger. In this case, the father denied an interview to the researcher Jim Tucker until after he'd written a book. this book went on to become a New York Times bestseller. So you could hypothesize that they were doing it to get attention. However, even in this case, I would be skeptical about fraud because it's very difficult to do something like that in the spotlight and not have somebody notice. You have to have a consistent story all the way through and not have any of your friends or family notice and point out any inconsistencies.
Because we're talking to a 2-year-old. You know, I mean, what am I going to do? Sit him in a corner and say, listen, now we're going to concoct this elaborate scheme, and you're going to imagine that you went through those things.
I would think that if fraud were to blame for all this evidence, then we would have some evidence of that fraud rather than just a hypothesis. Fraud also fails to account for the detailed knowledge which was demonstrated about this man's life. And it's unable to account for cases like Jaspir Singh, who refused to eat food cooked by his own parents because they were of a lower caste to the life which he had memories of. For a whole year and a half, a Brahmin neighbor kindly prepared all of his meals for him. This is not something his parents would exaggerate just to get attention, as it would have been a great inconvenience for them. Fraud is also unable to account for the birthmarks, as well as the emotions and behaviors. Stevenson found that 35% of children who reported memories of a past life had a birthmark or defect, which related in some way to a particular deceased individual. In 18% of those cases, they were able to verify the match with medical records. The birthmarks are interesting because they can be analyzed mathematically. Dr. Stevenson divided the human body into a grid of 160 squares. The chances of a single birthmark or defect matching a wound on the body of the deceased individual who matches the child's description is 1 in 160. The chances of 2 such aberrations matching is 1 in 25,000. Stevenson reported 18 cases where the child had 2 birthmarks, corresponding to a bullet entry and exit wound on the body of the deceased individual. A small percentage of these birthmarks are very similar to birthmarks which are very common in the population. However, most of them are far more unique.
There's a little boy from Sri Lanka. He says he was killed by a shot in the head. And this is the wound. And a boy from India who died in a car crash that crushed his leg.
There's also a little girl, a case where the previous person had had skull surgery just before dying, and this girl was born with this band going around her head.
Very unusual on the back of her head. Yeah.
Very unusual.
Now, you may wonder how it's possible, even if reincarnation is going on, that the soul is carrying with it impressions from one body and imprinting them on the new body as biological features. This phenomenon is actually fully consistent with what Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita. In chapter 8, text 6, Krishna says, whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, that state he will attain without fail. In most of the cases, children who report memories of a past life speak of a traumatic death. This trauma would have left profound impressions on their psyche, which they would have carried with them into the new body, which explains why the memories stick with them and why they often carry birthmarks or birth defects, which relate to the impressions from this traumatic death. I should point out, this isn't the only evidence we have of minds influencing bodies. One example is placebos.
There's a study from America that shows that actually the effect of placebos is increasing. And they say that's because there's so much TV promotion of all sorts of drugs, go to your doctor and ask for this, that, and the other, because that will cure them, that people have a real deep belief and faith in the idea that a pill will cure them. And the effect of a placebo is even stronger if you inject it into someone.
Hypnosis is also known to produce effects on the body.
Now, there was one male patient who was trying to give up smoking, and his therapist suggested to him, well, look, you should really think of how smoking affects others. I mean, what if you were a mother carrying an unborn baby? Now, he heard this in hypnosis, and he took it to heart, and was soon convinced he was pregnant. And he displayed classical, physical, obvious symptoms of false pregnancy. He had morning sickness, he had a swollen stomach, he'd even got secretion from his nipples.
Another kind of evidence we have for the mind's ability to influence the body is that of maternal impressions.
These are situations in which an expectant mother observes some dramatic, usually traumatic or horrific imagery during her pregnancy. And this produces a physiological impact on her unborn child. And again, the University of Virginia studied many hundred cases of this to see if there's a close correspondence between what the event the mother said she saw and the effect on the child. And out of 50 key cases that they looked at, 32 of them involved birth defects, including serious defects like the congenital absence of a limb. You know, a typical case was a woman who witnessed a man having his left ear chopped off, and her baby was born without a left earlobe.
There's also stigmata, which is wounds that appear on the body of a devout Christian, which resemble the wounds described on the body of Christ during his crucifixion.
Early in the 20th century, the tiny rustic Bavarian village of Konnersreuth became famous as the home of a stigmatist. She was Teresa Neumann. She had wounds on her hands and feet and in her side. But most dramatic of all was the blood streaming down her face, as seen in the...
Now I'll go through a couple cases of children who remember their past lives to show some examples of the kind of evidence. We'll start with the famous case of James Leininger, which I mentioned earlier.
He was a normal 7-year-old with a unique passion, an extreme fascination with World War II fighter planes. His parents say began as a toddler.
And I said, "Oh, look, there's a bomb on the bottom." He said, "That's not a bomb, that's a drop tank."
Then came the violent drawings and night terrors.
Bombing ships, you see men parachuting. Here's another one where planes are dropping bombs.
Help me. He would just be crying. He'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." He laid on his back and kicked up at the ceiling, and he goes, "Mama, the little man's going like this." And he laid on his back and kicked his feet up. The little man's going, "Ooh, ooh, 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 ooh," can't get out. And I said, "Well, who's the little man, baby?" And he goes, "Me." I thought Bruce and I were just gonna faint.
They questioned, what kind of plane?
Corsair.
"Why did your airplane crash?"
My plane was shot down.
Who shot your plane?"
He looked at me like I was a village idiot. He said,
"The Japanese."
He said his name was James,
But his name is James.
whose plane took off from the USS Natoma Bay and was shot down over Chichijima. The Leiningers hoped to disprove it, but learned it was all real, including a pilot named James Houston. Leo Pyatt served with Houston.
Yes, there was a Jim Houston, a rather large shell, just hit him in the engine, and it burst into flames and went down.
James recognized other shipmates by name and told his mother about James Houston's most treasured possessions and his sisters, Annie and Ruth.
The case of James Leininger shows many prominent features. He had obsessive behavior.
And then during the day, he would take his toy airplanes and he would say, "Airplane crash on fire," and he would slam them nose first, bam, into the coffee table. He would do this over and over again. So that looks very similar to what we in children's mental health call post-traumatic play, where a child who has experienced or witnessed something traumatic then reenacts the scene over and over again in their play. And when you combine that with his nightmares, he really looks like a child who'd been traumatized, but he had not been, at least in this life.
They were able to identify a pilot who died just as James Leininger described, the life of which James Leininger was able to give accurate information of. Here's a list of the information he gave, which later proved to be accurate.
What I can do is list all the items where we have definite documentation that was made before anyone knew anything about James Houston. Much of it comes from an interview that the Leiningers did with ABC News, again, before anyone knew if James's statements actually matched an actual pilot. James signed his drawings James 3. Houston was James Jr., which would make James Leininger the third James. James said that he flew off the Natoma. Houston was a pilot on the USS Natoma Bay. James said he flew a Corsair. Houston had flown a Corsair. He was actually flying a different plane when he was killed, but he was part of the squadron that had tested the Corsair for the Navy. James said he was shot down by the Japanese, and Houston was shot down by the Japanese. James said he died at Iwo Jima. Houston was the one Natoma Bay pilot killed during the Iwo Jima operation. James said one day, quote, "My airplane got shot into the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how I died." Eyewitnesses reported that Houston's plane was, quote, hit head-on right on the middle of the engine. James had nightmares of a plane crashing and sinking in the water. Houston's plane crashed in the water and quickly sank. And James said that Jack Larson was there, and Jack Larson was the pilot of the plane next to Houston's on the day that he was killed.
Now we'll have a look at a skeptical objection to this case.
After this case got some publicity, skeptics said, well, he just saw a Corsair at the museum and the name stuck with him.
Turns out that when he was 3, his parents took him to an air museum, and there was a display, and they read to him the display out loud with many of these details. And then when they went home, presumably they talked about it. And he was a very smart 3-year-old, and a smart 3-year-old can pick up stuff. And then maybe later, though he couldn't articulate that, later he was able to kind of articulate some of this stuff.
Dr. Jim Tucker has addressed this objection.
And in fact, if you go to the website of the Flight Museum, you see that, in fact, there is a Corsair there. Now, James's dad said there was not one there when he and James visited, so I looked into it and found that, in fact, his dad was correct. They had a Corsair. It had crashed at a public air show the year before they visited, and then they didn't get a replacement for 3 more years. So that is not where he learned about Corsairs.
The point here is that their trip to the museum cannot account for all of the knowledge which James Leininger displayed. The next case I'll show is of Titu Singh. Here it is narrated by Akundadi Das.
Torin, or Titu Singh as he's known in the family. And when he was 2.5, Titu began to tell his family of his other life in Agra, which was about 30 miles away, I believe. And he said, I used to live in Agra and I was the owner of a radio and TV shop. And my name is Suresh Verma. And I had a wife and 2 children. But I was shot dead, then cremated, my ashes thrown in the river. Now, his parents didn't take him very seriously at first, but he did exhibit behavior which was a little odd because he didn't really act as if he was part of their family. He kind of still felt he belonged somewhere else. So his elder brother decided to go to Agra to check it out. He found a shop called Suresh Radio, and he went in, and it was then being run by a widow named Uma, whose husband had been shot just as Titu had described. So Uma then decided to visit the same family the next day and see if there was any truth in what was going on. She arrived with her family unannounced. Titu happened to be outside and he saw them first and immediately recognized them and shouted to his parents, "Hey, my other family have come." So Titu asked Uma, "Sit near me," which is odd for a 5-year-old to do to a grown woman. And he asked about the children. He talked in detail about a family outing that they all went to the fair, and gave information that only Uma would have known. He even described burying gold in a hole in the house. So it was then agreed that Titu should go and visit Agra. And so when he and the family entourage arrived, Suresh's 2 children were, hidden off playing amongst some other neighborhood kids. This was kind of set up as a test. But Titu singled them out immediately. And when he went into his old shop, he started saying, "Oh, you've changed this and that. Oh, that used to be there, but then you've changed this."
The final case I'll present is the hypnotherapy one, which I alluded to earlier. Robert Snow was a police detective who came to participate in past life regression in an effort to debunk the phenomenon.
And I kind of made fun of it. I said, if past lives are true, why hadn't anyone ever proved it? Why hadn't anyone ever proved it in a past life?
And she recommended that maybe he should go through the regression and see what he thought of it.
And at first I said, no, I'm not going to do that. Then I got down to the point, gee, are you scared? And you don't want to ask a man or a police officer, particularly if you're scared. Of course you're not scared. And I agreed to do it.
Snow went to her office with a tape recorder and a skeptical attitude. But when Dr. Griffith put him under hypnosis, Captain Snow began seeing strange events he couldn't explain.
It's his truth. By nature damage. There's forces and characters. Dr. said the blood clot killed her.
Robert Snow initially dismissed the experience as some kind of hypnosis-induced anomaly. However, as time went on, he found the impressions from the session would not fade. In particular, the paintings started to become an obsession for him. He eventually set out to debunk the experience.
My whole idea was to find proof that this was all subconscious memories from this life. That I had seen the paintings somewhere before, in an art exhibition, in an art book, a history book somewhere. I decided what I'd do. I'd go to the public library, go to their art book collection, and thumb to it till I found the portrait. It took me several months, and I went through every single one and didn't find them. Visited every art gallery in Indianapolis, talked to all the art gallery owners, didn't find anything.
From his hypnotherapy session, he'd recorded 28 details which were provable.
The quality of the tape is extremely poor, but these are actual excerpts from that therapy session.
I'm an artist. My whole place is full of themes. You pick a manic spectrum with my children. I'm ordering a glass of wine. With a pain, I'm walking with pain. I'm painting a portrait of someone. I don't like their portraits. I need the money. The doctor said the blood clot killed her.
If he could find a painting that matched the one from his vision, then he could look into the life of that artist and disprove it all by showing that the features of his vision didn't match with the life of that artist.
Bob took a trip to New Orleans, where he wandered into an art gallery and found himself staring at the portrait of the hunchback woman. The name of the artist who painted it? James Carroll Beckwith.
So I asked the art dealer, I says, I've seen this painting somewhere before. I said, has this been in a museum or an exhibition somewhere? I said, I know I've seen this before. He said, no, you've never seen this before. He said, it's been in a private collection for years. Turns out, Beckwith kept a diary from his 19th birthday up to the day he died when he was 65. I read all 17,000 pages. Took me well over a year. So I had this list of 28 things they proved. I kept checking off, looking for the one thing that's wrong. What eventually happened is out of the 28, I was able to find confirmation for 27. I don't think I've ever had a murder case where I have this much evidence.
Details such as that his wife couldn't have kids for a medical reason, that a relative died of a blood clot, that he walked with a cane even though he didn't need to, and that he drank wine, which was uncommon at the time.
I held out to the rational belief that this is not true until the very, very end. Until I got to the part where I found out his mother died of a blood clot. You might know he won awards, you might know he died in 1917. It's not going to say his mother died of a blood clot. And that, to me, that was probably the factor that pushed me over to the other side. Before that, I kept saying, no, there's got to be some way you knew this stuff.
So here I've presented 3 cases of evidence for reincarnation. Dr. Ian Stevenson and his associates have over 2,500 cases on record. There's several other books written on the subject. I'll provide links in the description if you want to learn more about this. Obviously, if reincarnation is true, it has profound worldview implications.
Because it's not just to say, I was wrong. That, gee, okay, obviously I carry the memories of Carol Beck with my mind. It's more than that. You have to say, my whole view of the world's been wrong. My whole view of how the world works has been wrong.
The probability of God's existence would be greatly increased. According to Bhagavad Gita, God is the same in quality as us, but different in quantity. Meaning, if we've established the existence of the soul, then we're not far off from establishing the existence of God, because God is not a difference in category from us, but simply a difference in degree. We're small and God is infinite. For the sake of brevity, I haven't included all of the objections which have been leveled against Stevenson's and Tucker's research. Dr. Jim Tucker has dealt with many of these objections in his book, Life Before, and in papers which he's published. In his article titled Children Who Claim to Remember Previous Lives, Past, Present, and Future Research, he explains why some of the criticisms don't work. This objection comes from the fact that in many of the cases, the researchers had not investigated the case until after the previous personality had been identified. Thus, the possibility exists that after the children make a few general statements about having had a previous life, their parents find another family that has lost a family member. And once the 2 families exchange information, they come to think that the children demonstrated specific knowledge about the previous life beforehand that they in fact did not. In one study, Stevenson and Keel 2000, another researcher followed up on 15 cases which Stevenson had studied 20 years earlier. If the children were getting their information about this alleged past life from it being fed to them through the other family, then we would expect these cases to grow stronger over time as they learned more. However, what they found was only in one case did it grow stronger, and that was simply because they told the researchers a detail which they hadn't mentioned before. In most of the cases, they grew weaker over time, which is what we would expect as the children's memory from these past lives fade over time. Another study looked at whether the families were falsely attributing statements to the children which they hadn't made by comparing cases where they had written records before the 2 families met with cases with no such written records. Again, the findings were the opposite of what we would expect to find were the skeptic stories true. They found that the cases with no written records attributed less correct statements to the children than the ones that did have written records. This is presumably because in the cases without written records, they had forgotten some of the correct statements which the children had made prior to meeting the other family. And finally, here's a response to some more objections from the philosopher Robert Almader.
Somebody said, well, look, why even get involved in this? Because 80% of it's fraud. And I believe that may be, that may be true. That may be true. 80% of it may be fraud. But the important point is that if 100 people jump off the Empire State Building and 95 of them land just as you expect they would, painfully and disastrously, and five land gently and walk away, what do you think needs to be explained? The 5 that landed gently and walked away, they're statistically deviant. So some people will say in statistics, you don't have to explain any of this data because it's so infrequent and it's statistically deviant, and that most cases like this will turn out to be frauds. But when you take the clear cases and the hard cases, you can't explain those away by saying they're like the other ones, because you take them because they're very much unlike the other ones that were wrong. So that's sort of story. So, but there will be other objections too. I've heard people say, reincarnation couldn't occur because we don't know how it could occur. We don't know how. As scientists, we don't know what the mechanism is. We don't know how it couldn't have a mechanism that we could examine, so we can't know that it occurs. As objections go, that certainly leaves a good deal to be desired, because you may not know how something occurs, but have plenty of evidence that it occurs. I don't know how Slewfoot won the 5th race at Hialeah, but I can know that he did very easily. I don't know how you got into this room, but I know that you're here, that sort of story. So you don't have to know why things end up the way they are. Although in mature science, all our explanations will be causal. But there are kinds of explanations of events that are not causal, but they're purely statistical. You know that something's occurring, but you don't know why.
This has been my video presenting evidence for reincarnation. There's a lot more powerful evidence out there on this subject, so if you're interested in it, be sure to check that out. I'll have links in the description. If you like this kind of content, be sure to subscribe and give us a like to help us out in the algorithm. Please offer your objections down in the comments and I'll respond to those. Hare Krishna.